I never imagined my first real job would be as a cleaner. I had just moved to the city, desperate for any opportunity, any job that could help me pay the rent and get my feet on the ground. When I saw the ad for a cleaning position at the old Whitmore house, I didn't think twice. The pay was decent and the hours were flexible, perfect for someone like me, just starting out. The listing mentioned that it was a historic house and that they were looking for someone to take care of the place. I didn't think much of it at the time. A house was a house, right? I showed up for the interview, not entirely sure what to expect. The Whitmore house was an old mansion on the outskirts of town. From the outside, it looked like something straight out of a Gothic novel. Tall spires, faded stonework, a wrought iron fence covered in creeping ivy. It stood alone, surrounded by overgrown trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. It looked abandoned, but there was a strange energy about it, an unsettling aura that seemed to cling to the air around the house. The man who interviewed me, Mr. Ellis, was in his late 50s, with a graying beard and dark, heavy-set eyes that never seemed to blink. He was polite but distant, his voice low and gravelly, and I noticed that he didn't say much about the house itself. His focus was entirely on the job. He handed me a stack of paperwork, an old-fashioned cleaning schedule, and a set of keys. He mentioned that the house had been in his family for generations, passed down from one owner to the next. "Just be thorough," he said. "It's an old house, and it needs a lot of care. There are rules to follow, but they're simple. Don't disturb the attic, and never go into the basement." I was so eager to start the job that I didn't ask any questions. I didn't question the fact that Mr. Ellis barely smiled, or that he kept glancing nervously at the floor while we spoke. I was just happy to have found a place to work. The first day on the job, I arrived at the Whitmore house at 7 a.m., equipped with my cleaning supplies and the key to the front door. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me, the musty, damp odor of wood and old fabric. The house seemed frozen in time, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Dust and cobwebs clung to the furniture, and the air was thick with the kind of quiet you only find in places long abandoned. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling in places, the patterns barely visible beneath layers of grime. As I started to clean, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house was far too quiet, far too still. The occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath my feet was the only sound. But it wasn't just the silence that unsettled me. It was the way the house seemed to watch me. It was as if the walls themselves were aware of my presence, waiting for me to do something wrong. Around noon, as I was cleaning the large sitting room, I noticed a small crack in the wall. It wasn't obvious at first, but the longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to stretch and widen. It wasn't just a crack in the plaster. It felt like a wound, like the house was trying to speak to me, but I couldn't hear its words. The crack ran from the floor to the ceiling, and I couldn't help but feel drawn to it. I knelt down and get a closer look, but before I could touch it, I heard a noise, a soft whisper like a breath escaping someone's lips. I snapped my head around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. I stood up quickly, brushing my hands on my pants, trying to shake off the feeling. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself, but even as I said it, I knew that something wasn't right. The house felt alive. It was as if it were breathing, shifting, reacting to my every movement. I didn't mention the whisper to Mr. Ellis when he came by to check on my progress. I didn't want to seem foolish. But as the days went on, the whispering grew louder, and I began to hear it in different parts of the house. I would be scrubbing the floors in the dining room, and I'd hear it behind me. Soft murmurs, low words I couldn't understand. I would stop, listen, and wait for it to stop, but it always did, just before I turned to look. And then, one night, it happened. I had stayed late to finish up some cleaning, and as I made my way to the kitchen to grab my things, I heard the whisper again, this time coming from behind the kitchen door. I stood frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was so close, as if someone was standing right behind me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. But the whispering stopped, and the house fell back into its usual oppressive silence. I turned to leave, but the door in front of me creaked open, just enough to let a sliver of darkness spill through. My stomach twisted as I stared at the door, my hand frozen on the handle. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the curiosity. Maybe it was the feeling that I needed to know what was happening in this house. I pushed the door open, and that was when I saw it. A shadow, tall, dark, and formless, stood at the far end of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't just a shadow. It felt like it was alive, like it was breathing with the house. It shifted slightly, and I could almost hear it move. Then it spoke. "Leave." The word "leave" reverberated in my mind, ringing louder than any voice I had ever heard. I froze, my feet rooted to the floor, a strange chill creeping up my spine. The shadow, that dark, formless figure at the far end of the kitchen, was still. It hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence, like a heavy weight pressing in on me. My heart raced as I struggled to catch my breath, my eyes never leaving the shape in front of me. For a moment, I stood there, unsure of what to do. I wanted to turn and run, to leave the room and pretend nothing had happened. But my legs felt like stone, unable to move. The whispering from before, those soft, barely audible murmurs, had faded, replaced by this one clear command: leave. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't take a step toward me, but I could feel it pulling at me, a subtle force that seemed to be tugging at my very soul. It was as if the shadow was more than just a figure. It was alive, a living, breathing presence that was connected to the house itself. And then the temperature dropped. The air turned frigid, like a wave of cold had swept into the kitchen from somewhere deep within the walls. My breath came out in visible puffs as I instinctively wrapped my arms around myself to stave off the growing chill. I could feel the cold in my bones seeping into my skin, and yet I couldn't bring myself to look away from the figure. "Leave," it repeated, but this time its voice wasn't a whisper. It was a command, a dark and forceful thing that filled the space around me. The air became thick, as if something unseen was pushing in on me, forcing me to obey. I managed to step back, my legs moving against the weight of the fear that held me in place. The kitchen seemed to distort around me, the walls warping as if they were alive, closing in like the jaws of some unseen predator. My mind raced, the sharp edge of panic cutting through my thoughts. What was this thing? What was happening to me? And then, with one final push of strength, I turned and ran. I bolted toward the kitchen door, my pulse thundering in my ears as I slammed it open. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, but the air in the hallway felt just as cold, just as oppressive. The walls pressed in, the darkness stretching around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The shadow, whatever it was still there, lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for me to turn around. I reached the front door and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I had to get out of this house. I had to leave. I didn't care what was inside, what the house was hiding. I just knew that I couldn't stay there any longer. I finally managed to unlock the door and rushed outside into the cold night air. The fresh air was a shock to my senses, and for the first time since I'd arrived at the Whitmore house, I felt a little relief. The house, that thing inside of it, seemed to be locked behind me, and for a moment I thought I was free. I stood outside, taking deep breaths, trying to steady my racing heart, but the uneasy feeling that had settled inside me wouldn't go away. The whispering was gone, but the cold still lingered, and I could still feel the weight of the house pressing against me. I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. I hadn't escaped. The house hadn't let me go. The thing inside, whatever it was, had wanted me to leave. It was toying with me, testing me, but there was no escaping what I had stumbled into. I turned and looked back at the Whitmore house, standing tall against the night sky. The windows glowed faintly, the shadows behind them shifting, as if the house itself were alive, watching me. But before I could take a step away, the door to the house creaked open, slowly at first, and then it swung wide. The cold air from inside poured out, and I could swear I heard something inside. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps coming toward the door. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't go back inside, but I also knew that something was waiting for me in that house, something I had no choice but to face. I had been warned about the rules, about the house, but I had ignored them. I had broken the first rule by stepping inside. The whispers, the shadows, the figure that had haunted me, they weren't just part of the house. They were part of the curse that had been laid on this place, and now I was part of it. The door was still open, and the footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear them clearly now, echoing through the cold night air. They weren't my footsteps. They were coming for me. I turned to run, but my feet refused to move. It was like something invisible was holding me in place, pulling me back toward the house. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around me, and the shadows stretched longer and longer, reaching for me like hands. I had to go back inside. I had to face whatever was waiting for me. With a deep breath, I stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the Whitmore house once more. The moment I stepped back inside the Whitmore house, I felt it, a shift in the air, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The door behind me slammed shut, and I could feel the change. The house felt alive, like it was responding to my presence, adjusting to my every movement. The temperature had dropped once more, the cold air seeping into my skin, chilling me to the bone. I stood in the foyer, trying to shake the feeling that I had made a mistake. The walls were the same, old wood, peeling paint, fading wallpaper, but now they seemed to close in on me. The familiar hallway stretched before me, but the shadows had deepened. The flickering light from the overhead chandelier cast in long, unsettling shapes on the floor. I could hear the distant creaking of the house, the groaning of the old floorboards, as though the very building was shifting beneath my feet. I didn't want to move forward. I didn't want to step deeper into the darkness that seemed to swallow the house whole. But I knew I couldn't turn back. The house wouldn't let me. It was waiting for me to face what I had opened, what I had disturbed by coming here in the first place. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The rules flashed in my mind. The warning Gregory had given me. The first rule had already been broken, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the rules weren't just suggestions. They were part of something much bigger, something much older. The house wasn't just haunted, it was bound by these rules, and breaking them had consequences. I had already broken one rule. What would happen if I broke another? I turned down the hallway, my footsteps slow, deliberate, as though every step might bring me closer to the unknown. The walls seemed to stretch farther ahead, the space around me growing colder with every passing second. The shadows seemed to dance at the edge of my vision, just beyond the light, as if they were waiting for me to slip up. I reached the first door on the left. It was slightly ajar, the dark wood gleaming faintly in the low light. I could feel something calling to me from within. My heart beat faster as I hesitated. Was this room part of the curse? Was it safe to enter? Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. The room was filled with darkness. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was thick, a suffocating kind of blackness that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, the door closing softly behind me. The temperature in the room was freezing, and I could see my breath hanging in the air. I squinted, trying to make out anything in the dark. My eyes slowly adjusted, but the shadows seemed to swirl around me, moving in unnatural ways, like they were alive. I could feel them watching me, closing in, pressing down on me. And then I heard it, a soft, low whisper. It came from the far corner of the room, and though I couldn't see anyone, the voice was unmistakable. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was distant, like a memory trying to make itself heard. It wasn't just a voice. It felt like it came from within the walls, from the very structure of the house itself. I looked around the room, but there was nothing. Just empty space, a single chair in the corner, and a large, dusty mirror on the wall. The mirror was cracked, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. But even from where I stood, I could see it clearly. There was something wrong with the reflection. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. In the mirror, I saw myself, yes, but I also saw something else. Behind me, just over my shoulder, was a shadow. A tall figure, its face obscured by darkness. The reflection seemed to move with me, but it didn't belong. It wasn't mine. I turned quickly, my heart thudding in my chest, but there was no one there. No figure, no shadow, just the empty room. The reflection was gone. I turned back to the mirror, my hands trembling as I reached out to wipe away the dust. That's when I saw it. On the cracked surface of the mirror, written in faint, fading letters, was a single word: leave. I backed away, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. My mind raced. The whispering, the shadows in the mirror, the eerie presence of the house. It was all part of something much darker than I had ever anticipated. I had come here for a job, for something simple, and now I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. I turned to leave the room, but before I could reach the door, I felt it. A hand, cold and damp, brushing lightly against my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty room. The whispering returned, louder this time, as if the walls themselves were speaking to me. "You can't leave." My breath caught in my throat, and I bolted from the room. I didn't look back. I didn't care about the rules anymore. I needed to get out of the house, away from whatever this place was, whatever it had become. But as I turned down the hallway, I noticed something. The walls were different. The wallpaper that had been peeling earlier now seemed to move, like it was alive, curling around the edges as if it were trying to trap me. The door I had entered through, the door that had been closed, was now wide open. I was no longer alone. I stood in the hallway, my pulse racing, trying to steady my breathing as I processed what had just happened. The whispering, the hand on my shoulder, It all felt too real. But I had to leave. I had to get out of here. The house was becoming something else, something alive, and I was beginning to realize that I had stumbled into something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. I turned back toward the open door to the room I had just fled from. The shadows within seemed to stretch and shift, swirling like tendrils of smoke. I didn't want to look inside. I knew I wasn't supposed to be here, that something was waiting for me. But the door stood ajar, inviting me to step back into its dark embrace. I swallowed hard, taking a step toward the door, but my feet felt heavy, like the house itself was trying to hold me in place. The air around me had grown thick, almost oppressive, like I was swimming through it. The walls, once ordinary, now seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, as if they were watching me, sensing my every move. A distant sound broke through my thoughts, a soft thumping, like footsteps, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. The thumping grew louder, closer, as if someone or something was walking toward me. My body tensed, and I instinctively turned to look behind me, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, yet the sound continued, now accompanied by another noise, a low, guttural growl. I froze. My eyes darted around the hallway, desperately searching for the source of the noise, but everything was still. The growl grew louder, its resonance filling the space, reverberating through the floor beneath me. It was coming from above. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. The staircase that led to the upper floors loomed before me, its dark banister twisting into the shadows above. The growl seemed to echo from the top of the stairs, the source of the sound still out of sight. Something was up there. I didn't know what, but I had no doubt that it was far worse than anything I had encountered so far. Without thinking, I bolted toward the stairs, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. Every instinct told me to get to safety, to escape, but there was no way out. The front door was gone. The house had sealed me inside, and there was no turning back. The staircase creaked under my weight as I hurried up, the sound of my footsteps mingling with the growl, now louder, more menacing. As I reached the top, I felt the air grow colder, the temperature plummeting as if I had crossed into another world. The hallway above was darker, the shadows deeper. There were no lights on this floor, and the silence was deafening. I could barely make out the shapes of the doors, the faint outlines of rooms that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Then, at the far end of the hallway, I saw it. A door, standing slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out from the crack. The light was dim, flickering, like it was fighting to stay on. The door was different from the others. It was ancient, its wood warped and cracked, the handle a tarnished brass that looked like it had been untouched for centuries. It felt like it was calling to me, drawing me toward it, and I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved before I could think, and I found myself standing before the door, my hand reaching out to touch the handle. The moment my fingers brushed against the cold metal, I felt it. A shock, like electricity coursing through my body. My vision blurred for a second, the world tilting as if I were falling. The house seemed to shift, the walls groaning, the air thickening with something ancient, something alive. I twisted the handle, and the door creaked open. Inside was nothing like the rest of the house. The room was a stark contrast to the decaying, forgotten halls. The walls were clean, immaculate, and yet the air inside felt wrong, heavy with a sense of unease. The room was empty, save for a large, antique mirror on the far wall. The mirror was framed in dark wood with intricate carvings that seemed to move, like they were alive. I stepped closer to the mirror, drawn to it by an unseen force. My reflection was distorted in the glass, the edges warping and rippling as though the mirror itself was trying to pull me inside. I reached out, but the moment my hand touched the surface, a sharp pain shot through my fingers, like a jolt of electricity. I pulled my hand back, but the mirror didn't release me. Instead, I felt a pull, something tugging me toward it, as if the room itself were trying to consume me. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around frantically, trying to find a way out, but the door had vanished, replaced by another stretch of empty wall. There was no escape. I was trapped. Suddenly, I heard it again, a low growl, now closer, more menacing. The sound was coming from behind me, from the shadows in the corner of the room. I didn't dare look, but I could feel it, the presence of something watching, something waiting. I turned back to the mirror. My reflection wasn't mine anymore. It was a twisted version of myself, its eyes hollow, its mouth twisted into a grin that wasn't my own. And then, as if in slow motion, my reflection began to step out of the mirror, its hand reaching for me. "You shouldn't have come." The voice, my voice, echoed from the mirror, filling the room. And then, everything went black. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for air, my body covered in a cold sweat. The darkness around me felt suffocating, pressing in on all sides, and for a moment, I thought I was still trapped in that room with the twisted mirror. But the silence was different now, heavier, almost oppressive, and I realized I wasn't in the same place. I opened my eyes slowly, trying to make sense of where I was. The floor beneath me was cold and hard, the walls dark and narrow, with no visible windows or doors. My surroundings were unfamiliar, and the claustrophobic feel of the space immediately set my heart racing. The air smelled damp, like old wood and mildew, and the echo of my breath filled the empty room. I forced myself to sit up, my mind still reeling from the distorted reflection and the unbearable sense of dread I had felt in the mirror room. I couldn't remember how I had ended up here, or if I had truly left the room at all. The more I tried to focus, the more the world around me seemed to warp, as though the house itself was bending reality to its will. With a shaky breath, I stood up, my legs weak beneath me, and tried to make sense of the space. The walls were bare, the faintest glimmer of light spilling from cracks in the wood above. I reached out to steady myself against one of the walls, but as my fingers brushed the surface, I felt it again. The same cold sensation from the mirror room, like something was lurking just beneath the surface of reality, waiting to pull me back into the darkness. My pulse quickened, and I took a step forward, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of escape. There were no doors, no windows, just an endless expanse of narrow walls that seemed to stretch on forever. But I could feel it, the weight of something watching me from the corners of the room, something that had always been there, just out of sight. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I pressed on, moving further into the darkness, trying to ignore the growing sense of terror that threatened to overtake me. But as I walked, the shadows seemed to twist, shifting and slithering as if they were alive. The walls groaned, the floor creaking beneath my feet, and I could hear faint whispers, soft, low voices, whispering just out of reach. Leave. The words echoed in my mind, a constant refrain that I couldn't escape. Leave. I wasn't sure if the words were coming from the walls or from within me, but they seemed to grow louder with every step I took. The more I tried to ignore them, the more insistent they became. Leave this place. I shook my head, trying to block out the whispers, but they only grew louder, more urgent. The walls seemed to close in on me, the floor beneath me trembling with an unnatural force. I could feel the very foundations of the house shifting, warping, reacting to my fear. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it. At the far end of the room, a faint sliver of light flickered, like the crack of a door slightly ajar. I hesitated, my body frozen, but the light was like a beacon drawing me in. I had to move toward it. I had no choice. I walked toward the light, each step heavy, each movement slow and deliberate. The closer I got, the more I could feel the weight of the house, the darkness around me pressing harder, like a hand on my chest. The whispers were deafening now, the voices overlapping, filling my mind with their pleading, their warnings. Leave. The light grew brighter as I reached it, and as I stepped closer, I saw that it was coming from a crack in the wall, narrow, just wide enough to slip through. The edges of the crack glowed faintly, as if the very walls were alive, pulsing with energy. I could feel it in the air, the magnetic pull of whatever lay beyond the crack. It was like the house was pulling me, urging me forward, pushing me toward the unknown. I pressed my hands against the crack, my breath shallow, and as I pushed, the walls creaked, the crack widening just enough for me to slip through. I squeezed through the narrow opening, my heart racing, and when I finally emerged on the other side, I found myself standing in a dark hallway. This hallway was different. The walls were smooth, the air fresh, and the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued me earlier seemed to fade away. But something about the place still felt wrong. It was too quiet. The silence was unbearable. I could feel the weight of the house around me, and I knew that whatever I had just passed through had led me into a new part of the building, one that was even darker than the last. And then the whispers returned. "You shouldn't be here." I turned quickly, my eyes darting around the hallway, but there was nothing there, no one. Only the faint glow of the light at the end of the hall, far off in the distance. "Leave now." The voice was louder this time, closer. It was not coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from inside the hallway, from somewhere beyond my sight. I turned toward the light, but my feet felt heavy, like they were glued to the floor. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body refused to obey. The whispers had become a roar, filling my mind, drowning out everything else. I could feel the walls pressing in on me again, the darkness closing around me. The light at the end of the hall seemed to grow further away, no matter how fast I moved. And then a figure appeared. It was tall, shadowed, its face hidden by a hood. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. The figure didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, a presence that consumed everything in the room. It stepped forward, its footsteps silent but undeniable. "You should have left when you had the chance." I stood frozen in place, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. The figure in front of me was unlike any person I had seen before. Its form was tall, cloaked in shadow, its hood concealing any trace of a face. Yet I could feel its presence like a weight, pressing against me, suffocating the air around me. It didn't move, but its gaze, though unseen, felt like it was cutting through me, peeling away everything I thought I understood about this place. "You should have left when you had the chance." The voice came again, deep and chilling, like the echo of a distant memory, an ancient command that had been waiting for me. I wanted to speak, to ask what it meant, but my mouth felt dry. No words came. It was as though the figure's presence had paralyzed my entire body, filling me with a cold sense of dread that I couldn't shake. The hallway seemed to stretch around us, closing in, the walls groaning as if the house itself was alive, responding to the figure's presence. The air grew heavier, denser, pressing down on me with every passing second. The whispers that had been haunting me, growing louder and more frantic, were now all but deafening, a chorus of voices from the shadows. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It felt like I was sinking into the floor, trapped in place. I could feel the weight of the figure's gaze on me, like it was digging into my very soul. I had made a mistake. I had broken the rules, and now I was paying the price. "You have crossed the threshold," the figure said, its voice more final now. "You have opened the door, and now you will stay. Forever." The room around me began to shift again, the walls warping, bending, the floor beneath me starting to pulse like a heartbeat. I could see flashes of light, quick, fleeting glimpses of strange, distorted images. The shadows twisted and moved, pulling toward the figure like it was a magnet. The house itself seemed to be reacting to its presence, trembling, shuddering as if it were alive. The darkness in the corners of the hallway thickened, and I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the walls, something moving. Then the whispers stopped. It was sudden, abrupt. The silence that followed was deafening, and then I felt it, a shift in the air. The figure before me began to move, slowly, deliberately. Each step it took reverberated through the hallway, and I could feel the ground beneath me tremble. It reached out a hand, not toward me, but toward the hallway beyond. As it did, I saw the shadows in the walls flicker and writhe, like they were alive, like the house was alive, reacting to its presence. "You are a part of this place now," the figure intoned, its voice both cold and somehow familiar. "You've entered the world of the lost, the world of those who were never meant to leave. You will serve the house. You will serve its rules." I couldn't breathe. The air had grown thicker again, the whispers returning, now louder, more frantic. I could feel their presence around me, in the walls, in the floor, the ceiling, in me. The house was changing, and I was changing with it. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but it felt like the very fabric of the world was closing in. I tried to turn around, but the hallway stretched endlessly behind me. It was a maze, a prison with no way out. The more I struggled, the more the shadows pressed in, blocking my path, pushing me back toward the figure. "You are bound now," it said, its voice low, as if it were finally satisfied with my terror. "This is your home, your place, forever. The rules are simple. Do not question them. Do not try to escape, and most importantly—" The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, its shadow falling over me like a cloak. It leaned in, its voice now a soft whisper. "Never, ever break the last rule." And with that, the world around me seemed to tilt. The walls blurred, the shadows stretched, and I felt myself being pulled, dragged into the space between the dimensions. The air was thick with something I couldn't understand, something ancient and primal. My chest tightened as I gasped for air, but there was none. The house was consuming me, changing me, and I couldn't stop it. In the distance, I saw the faintest flicker of light, a doorway, perhaps, or an escape. But before I could make sense of it, the figure's voice rang out again, louder now, reverberating through my entire body. "You're a part of the house now." The light grew brighter, closer, and I tried to reach for it, my body moving of its own accord. but the shadows gripped me tighter, dragging me back. And then, everything went dark.